Hey guys, welcome to this channel. My name is Patrick Howard. I'm a poker coach and a professional online cash game player, and I'm the founder of Mobius Poker, which is a coaching company for high-stakes professional poker players. If you followed me in the past, you may already be familiar with my blog, the Mobius Poker blog, and this channel is going to be pretty similar. It's basically going to give you some insight into how I think about poker and hopefully give you some advice for how you can become more successful in poker, whether you're just starting out or you're already playing professionally full-time. Since this is my first video, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I'm 30 years old. I have a background in science, specifically physics. And about 7 years ago, I started a master's PhD program in biophysics. And I was on a pretty standard path to becoming a scientist. But pretty quickly after I started that program, I just knew that it wasn't for me. It wasn't really what I was excited about, and it wasn't something I could see myself doing for the rest of my life. I made the decision to quit that program. And then for about a year and a half after, I just worked in restaurants, cooking in kitchens, just to sort of reset my brain because I was very burnt out at the time. I had always played poker at an amateur level. My older brother, Nick Howard, is also a poker player and coach, and he has a coaching company called Poker Detox. And he inspired me to get back into poker. So I started playing full-time in 2019. I started out at 200 NL on Bovada, and I had a bankroll of, I think, around $10,000 at the time. And by July of 2019, about 7 months after I had started, I was at 2,000 NL. So I moved up the stakes pretty quickly. In 2019, I'd also started coaching for Poker Detox a little bit. And in 2020, I switched from playing poker full-time after a successful first year to coaching full-time. And from 2019 to 2021, I led the cash game team at Poker Detox to over $5 million in profits. In 2022, I started my own coaching company called Mobius Poker, and I work exclusively with high-stakes players. So I only have one public program right now that's called Mobius Cash, and I take on about half a dozen students per year at 500 NL or higher. If you're interested in any of that stuff, I will leave some links in the description down below, and you can check that out if you'd like. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm sure I'll get deeper into that stuff in future videos. But in this video, I wanted to talk about tilt. Tilt is a very common term in the poker universe. I define it as any time we allow emotions to make decisions for us at the poker table, rather than logic and rational thinking and intuition and all the other positive stuff that goes into making a decision. When you're on tilt, you're not necessarily listening to all of that stuff. Instead, you're making a decision simply because you're angry or because you're scared and you don't want to lose more money and things like that. Tilt can lead to aggressive mistakes, but it can also lead to passive mistakes. And I would argue that it actually leads to passive mistakes more often, at least when we're talking about professional poker players. Tilt affects everyone. It just usually has less of an impact on very good players, but everybody makes mistakes out of tilt from time to time. So for example, here's a hand that I played recently, about a couple weeks ago, where I made a mistake because I was tilted. To give you a little bit of context for this hand, I've been on a little downswing recently, and I think at the time I played this hand, between this session and the session before it, I was down about 10 grand. And so this is 5-10, no limit. So that means about 10 buy-ins. And I was starting to get pretty frustrated. Not that 10 buy-ins is a particularly huge downswing, but the games that I was playing in were actually extremely soft. And I had a lot of recreational players at my table. And so I think my win rate was very high in these games, and I was just getting extremely unlucky and losing a lot of money in a very short period of time. So this hand was a 4-bet pot. The cutoff opens, and I 3-bet my 8-7 of diamonds, and I face a 4-bet, and I call. So this is all pretty standard. Flop comes 10, 6, deuce, rainbow, and I face c-bet between 20 and 25% of the pot. This is a very standard call. We can actually raise here at a low frequency as well. I elected to just call. Turn is an 8, and our hand improves. We have a pair plus a gutter now. And this is actually a very good card for us. I can actually lead here a lot, but I just decided to keep it simple and check. And then our opponent jams, and I decided to fold here. Now, if you're relatively new to poker and you haven't studied much theory, this might not stick out to you as a particularly huge mistake. On the other hand, if you are an experienced player and you're well versed in theory, you might be thinking, how the hell could he possibly fold that? In order to show the actual EV of this call, I'm going to consult GTO Wizard. If you're not familiar with GTO Wizard, it's basically a database of GTO, game theory optimal solutions in the cloud. So you can look up pretty much any kind of hand that you might have played, and there will be a solution in this database to show you what the game theory optimal strategy was for that spot. Now you can, of course, run your own simulations using a program like PioSolver, but GTO Wizard is a lot faster and it's just more user-friendly than running your own sims. So I'm a big fan of this program. There are, of course, other commercial trainers out there too that you can use which offer a similar product, but GTO Wizard right now is my personal favorite. Now I'm going to assume that you've seen a solver before. I won't go over all of the basics of how to read these solutions, but basically with Wizard, we input the actions up here in the top. So I have cutoff, open, raising. I've got the big blind, which is us, 3-betting, cutoff, 4-betting, and big blind calling. This is our defense versus the 4-bet pre-flop. You can see that we need to pure call all of our suited connectors, and they're very plus EV to continue with. On the flop, facing the small c-bet, this is what our defense looks like. So, like I said, we can raise quite often with 8-7, as long as we don't have spades at least. So if we have a backdoor, we can raise almost half the time. Sometimes we like to jam and sometimes we just raise small. Another interesting thing about this defense is that you can see 7-6 suited and 6-5 suited actually pure raise. Sometimes they jam, sometimes they raise small, but they really never call. And then our other bluff raise comes from king-queen suited. Regardless of the suits, it's raising between like 30 and 40% of the time, it looks like, calling sometimes and then folding sometimes. If you look at the overall frequencies, we're raising this flop about 26% of the time. So I think it's very likely that the average regular won't be raising this flop enough, and when they do raise the flop, they're probably under bluffing. So how can you exploit that? Well, you can exploit it by c-betting more, and especially with more equity-driven hands like draws that don't like to be raised as much because you get forced off your hand. So I think that's just an interesting thing to point out, that this is just a very hard defense to manage on the flop. The turn, we can actually lead about a quarter of the time, and with my hand, it looks like leading about 20% of the time, but I decided to check. We face the jam, which is not the most common size that we're going to see. We're mostly going to see a small continuation bet, but my opponent can jam as well. And then if we look at the defense versus the jam, and we look at 8-7 of diamonds, we can see the EV of calling is 13.91. Those are big blinds, so it's about 14 big blinds plus EV to call. And of course, the EV of folding is 0. And so to put that into perspective, typically in poker, we measure our win rate in big blinds per 100 hands. So if you have a win rate of 7 big blinds per 100, that is an elite win rate. You're, at least in most situations in modern games, you're reaching the ceiling of how much you could realistically win. If you have a win rate of 7 big blinds per 100, that means your expected value after 200 hands is about 14 big blinds. So with this single mistake, we've effectively wiped out our win rate or our expected value for 200 hands. And so this is a pretty massive mistake. Now, it is a big pot. We're playing for stacks, so the EVs and the mistakes will always be larger. But still, it's just a very large error to make. And I would consider like anything over a few big blinds in this spot to be a real blunder. For those of you who don't study much theory, it might be kind of counterintuitive that you have to just play for stacks with a hand like this, and it's so plus EV to call. But if you go to the breakdown tab in GTO Wizard, this is showing the call in green and the blue fold frequencies by the category, the hand strength that we have. So we have all the way from sets at the top down to no made hand at the bottom. And you can see that really the only categories that are blue are unpaired hands and low pair hands, which low pairs we have almost none of. We don't have really any deuce X. So if you look at third pair and up, I mean, we basically never get to fold a pair in this spot. And that's just because of the stack to pot ratio and the fact that a lot of our hands that are one pair hands also have a lot of additional equity. They probably have a gutter with them, like my current hand, 8-7 suited. So because we're just facing a 2/3 bet all in, we just can't fold very much. On the turn, our range actually, if you look at the normalized range heights, we can see that ace queen suited actually makes up most of my range here on the turn. And I have to fold that a lot. We're folding all of our ace queen, spades, diamonds, clubs. And then interestingly enough, ace queen of hearts versus the jam is actually indifferent to calling. It doesn't matter. Like, we're supposed to call most of the time, but the EV of calling is essentially equal to the EV of folding. And so with the nut flush draw, that's a pretty strong hand. I think that's might be pretty surprising to some people. The problem with this combo is just that it blocks basically all of the opponent's bluffs, at least in theory, versus this sizing. Now, is this actually a 14 big blind mistake in practice? We know it is in theory, but what about not in solver land, but in real games? Is this actually that big of a mistake? I don't think so. I think it's a much smaller mistake, maybe half that or even a little bit less. And this is part of why I made this mistake, is because I thought my opponent would be under bluffing here. It's just simply kind of difficult to find all of the bluffs that you need. All the way going back from pre-flop, you can see this is my opponent's pre-flop 4-betting range. He's 4-betting a lot of his premium hands, but he's also slow playing a lot of them. He's 4-betting a lot of ace queen offsuit and a little bit of ace jack, king queen, king jack in theory. He might miss some of those. He might miss some of this king 9, ace 9 through ace 7 suited region of bluffs. So even starting from pre-flop, he might not be bluffing enough. He might miss some bluffs on the flop. He might c-bet a little bit too strong. And then he might miss some bluffs on the turn as well. He's supposed to be jamming ace king, ace queen, ace jack, and also like not supposed to be jamming aces or kings really ever. It's supposed to be slow playing a lot of value. He might not be doing that enough, which would cause him to under bluff on the turn. If he's playing his value too fast, that also will lead to an under bluff. So I do think that I was right in assuming that my opponent would be under bluffing here. But the other reasons that I made the mistake are simply that I wasn't studied enough in this spot. I didn't, for whatever reason, at least at the time, realize that this was such a profitable call, even though it should be kind of obvious that a 5-out pair plus a gutter facing a 2/3 bet all in is going to be very profitable. I didn't think it was 13 or 14 big blinds, whatever it was, profitable. And then finally, you add in the risk aversion that I was feeling because of the money that I was losing, and all of those things together led to the mistake, which was to fold. So I think that's typically what happens, especially when you get to higher levels. It's not just usually like tilt is when you know for sure that something is the right play, but you just do something else anyway. That does happen sometimes, but typically that's with like more recreational type players or people who are just starting out playing professionally. I think when you get to higher levels, it's more of like there's a combination of factors that lead to mistakes. It's not always that. I mean, a lot of times it is just pure lack of technical understanding, but when it comes to really obvious seeming blunders, I think that's typically what happens. And this sort of leads me to my overall point about tilt, which is that if you think about what regulars are trying to do most of the time, we're trying to match GTO. We're trying to play as aggressively as GTO. But we also trend risk averse, because what happens is there's variance in poker, and sometimes no matter what you do, no matter how well you play, you're going to lose money simply because of the cards that you're dealt. And this can last for a very long time. You can have losing months. You can lose for several months straight. And in those situations, the goal really is not to win, because winning is impossible, but it's just actually to lose less than your opponents. And what the mind does in situations like this is sometimes it confuses losing less with putting less money in the pot. And that's where poker really becomes difficult, is when you're getting punished and you have to continue putting tons of money in the pot because that's simply the correct action to do it in. And so what happens is every once in a while we feel tilted, we play too passively, and we make a fold that we normally wouldn't make. And because the rest of the time we're simply trying to play as aggressively as the GTO strategy, when you average all of these things out, we end up playing a little bit passively relative to GTO. And that's why when you look at large databases, you see that on average, people just generally fold too much and almost never over defend. So that's something to think about, and it's something that I stress with my students a lot. It comes up in a lot of different contexts. Pre-flop is another one. But basically, the idea is that if you're not trying to play a little bit more aggressive than GTO typically, then on average, you're going to play less aggressive than GTO. You're going to play too passive, because your tilt is going to come out to bite you every once in a while, and you're not going to play perfectly all the time. So sometimes you actually have to overcorrect. And I actually recommend, on average, trying to play a little bit looser than you think you should to protect yourself against situations like these. All right, so I asked you guys to submit some questions about mindset on Twitter, and you guys asked a ton of awesome questions. I might not even be able to respond to all of them in this video because you guys asked so many good ones. But if you want to participate in future episodes, you can tweet at me. My Twitter is @MobiusPoker. You can also DM me on Twitter or Instagram as well. I'm @MobiusPoker on both of them. So someone asked, sometimes we're 100% convinced of things we absolutely should be doing in poker or life in general, but we still don't do them. For example, firing a bet on the river when we know that our opponents are going to massively overfold. What mental program is running there? Well, I'll just respond to the poker part, but I think it's like I said in this video, which is that usually we don't do things if we're 100% sure that we absolutely should be doing them. If you are finding that that is a problem for you, I would definitely work with a mindset coach. I kind of would recommend most people work with a mindset coach, at least in the beginning, to get past certain mental blocks that might be causing this. But I think beyond that, most of the time what happens is we're not 100% sure. We're like 90% sure that we should do something. And then we have these other ideas that come in the hand, like, oh, maybe he's under bluffing in this particular spot, or in this case, maybe he actually won't overfold on this particular texture, whatever. Or maybe my blocker is bad, something like that. I think what happens is when we are maybe trending risk averse, what we actually want to do is fold, and then we justify it with these other data points in the hand. And then we forget about, like the most important reason for what we're doing, which is that on average, people fold too much, therefore we should be firing this bluff. So I think that's what's going on. most of the time it's more of a combination of factors rather than just intentionally blundering or self-sabotaging, something like that. Okay, somebody else said, I struggle with putting in volume when I'm winning. I'll have a 6 to 8 hour session planned out, but in the first hour, I'm up a few buy-ins. At this point, it's tough for me to play my A game, and I tend to lean risk averse. A lot of the time, I'll just leave. Okay, this is a very common problem. It's called protecting your wins. A lot of people do protect their wins to some extent. And the idea being that, if you just stop playing, you can't lose back the money that you made. If you're playing 2,000 hands, you might expect to make 1,000 big blinds or 50 big blinds. And if you start up, up 300 big blinds, your brain is telling you, job's finished. Let's go watch TV or, just do something fun now because we just made all this money. Well, unfortunately, that's not how it works. Poker is your upswings minus your downswings. Unfortunately, you can't just always have upswings. So if you should basically, as a professional poker player, you should have a schedule planned out beforehand. You should have an idea of how many hours per week you're going to play, what days per week, what times per week. And, unless you are just in that phase where you just love playing poker and you're always sitting down to play, if you're past that point, you're going to need to set up a schedule and just stick to it. And if you're not sticking to that schedule, at least 80% of the time, ideally like more than 90% of the time, that's another thing that you might consider working with a mindset coach on to try to help you figure out, why am I not able to show up for work? Sometimes you really just have to, as my friend Matt Marinelli says, just glue your ass to the chair, because poker is, you're self-employed. So nobody is going to force you to show up to work. You don't have a boss. You don't have customers. You don't even have coworkers, except for maybe, you could think of the people that you study with as your coworkers, but that's it. So you have to find some internal motivation. A lot of the time that's going to be how many hands you want to play and how much money you want to make in a year. And you should be able to, do the calculations of how much you need to play in order to make that happen. Now, in terms of actually playing risk averse, let's say you do actually glue your ass to the chair and you force yourself to finish this session, but you just play badly because you don't want to lose the money that you just made back. I would encourage you to investigate what you think it says about yourself if you do lose the money back, because clearly there's a fear there. And of course, logically, this is my win rate, therefore I need to play X amount of hands, X amount of hours to make the money that I want to make. But your emotional side of your brain is just saying something completely different. It's probably saying something like, I'm a bad poker player if I lose this money back, or I'm irresponsible if I lose this money back. So I would encourage you to investigate why you think that. A lot of times in the past, I felt really scared to sit down at the poker table, and I still do sometimes. And I've discovered that it's because I actually was thinking on some level, if I have a losing session, that actually makes me a worse poker player. And because I was kind of basing my self-worth on being a good poker player, who would I be if I didn't know how to play poker? This is kind of like the thing that I'm best at. That was a really scary prospect to me. It's almost like thinking I would die if I wasn't a winning poker player because I wouldn't know who I am anymore. So that's kind of deep, and maybe you can go into that with a lot of therapy or introspection if you're into that kind of thing. But I think it really is worth investigating, because clearly there's something going on there which is making you really scared to just do what you know is what you have to do. Okay, another person said, adjusting emotionally to stakes that are big for your background. How to not care about money when it starts to get big. So I'm assuming by your background, you're referring to kind of like how you grew up. So maybe if you grew up where like money was a problem in your family, and now suddenly you're gambling for thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, that can be really scary. For me personally, like I said in the beginning, before I got back into poker, I was working in restaurants. So I was making minimum wage. I think they started me at $8 or $9 an hour. And then at one point in 2019, just like a year later, I went on a $50,000 downswing. At another point, just the month before that, actually, I had a 70K month. And so the numbers were just so huge, especially when I think back to like how hard I had to bust my ass to make $9 the previous year, just, deveining shrimp or something for an hour, and my back is just killing me. It just didn't make any sense. And that can be really hard. So I think for me, what has happened is just, I've gotten better at poker. As you get stronger technically in poker, and you just know what the right answer is, you're going to do it whether or not the money is scary, at least most of the time. And over time, you will just become desensitized. It takes practice, but you have to just think about the money on the table as kind of not real money while it's on the table. It's more just like ammunition and not actual money. But, if you do come from this type of background where money has been tight in the past, it's probably just going to be harder for you. It's going to be a challenge. I think not too many people realize this, but a decent number of the poker players that are at the top of the game actually came from really affluent backgrounds, and they don't really have a lot of baggage around money for that reason. Like, money was just never an issue for them, and so they don't feel as bad when they lose it compared to somebody who had maybe parents who were constantly stressed about money and were saying you have to save, and if you waste money, that's irresponsible, things like that. I think quite a few poker players who have made it big just came from a totally different background than that. And I don't think that's something that really gets talked about very much, but I do think it's a real thing. But, otherwise, it just might take longer for you. You might need a larger bankroll. You might need 100 buy-ins when you actually could get by with 50 as you're moving up. So, if you're really feeling a ton of anxiety when you sit down to play, I would consider just increasing your bankroll for the stakes that you're playing, and hopefully that will help a little bit. I think it definitely does. If you're overrolled, it definitely does make it easier to play and not to get scared about the money. Just don't totally go overrolled, because then you're not going to make any money and you're going to get stuck at low stakes forever. So there's a balance, obviously. All right, guys, that's all I got. As you can see from the light around me, the sun has set and it's starting to get dark in my room. So I'm going to call this a video. Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content from me. That would help me out a lot, because especially right now, the channel is just starting. And thank you for watching. I hope you learned something, and good luck at the tables.